Hi there, I'm State Senator Justin Chenette here with a very special guest, Secretary of State Matt Dunlap. Hello, Matt. How are you?
Hello, Senator.
I'm so excited. So you've served a lot of different roles over the years.
Mm-hmm.
You served in the House of Representatives.
I sure did.
And then you've served 7 terms as Secretary of State.
Yeah.
So for the average person out there who's like, what does the Secretary of State job entail? What would you tell them?
Well, when I first got elected, one of my sisters asked me, what does the Secretary of State actually do? And I said, well, I make the state coffee and I answer the state phone. She said, oh, I always wondered. No two Secretaries of State do exactly the same things. And actually not every state has a Secretary of State. So I believe it's Utah, Alaska, and Hawaii do not have Secretaries of State. They have lieutenant governors that fulfill a lot of the same functions. Generally speaking, you find some themes. Elections, most Secretaries of State do elections, but not all. The Secretary of State in North Carolina does not oversee elections, for example. Some secretaries register financial instruments like securities. And that's a big part of what Secretary Galvin does in Massachusetts and in Delaware and some other states. Almost every state registers corporate entities. Only 3 of us have oversight of motor vehicles. Some have charge of state libraries and things like that. In Washington, the Secretary of State is the state's chief protocol officer.
Oh, interesting.
So, we all do things a little bit differently. But in Maine, it's a constitutional office because it's described in the Constitution, which has been amended 198 times. And some of the constitutional officers that we used to elect by ballot of legislature, we no longer elect. Like the state land agent. The adjutant general was elected by ballot of legislature. And until 1849, the Attorney General was actually appointed by the governor. So we amended the Constitution and included the AG in that whole mix. So I was originally charged in 1820 with keeping the records of the acts of the legislature and the governor. Record keeping has taken on some different definitions over the last 199 years. So in the 1870s, we began registering corporate entities, for example. In the 1890s, we took over oversight of elections and keeping the records of the tabulations of the vote. In 1905, we began registering motor vehicles. And then in 1965, we came around full circle to record keeping. We then created the State Archives and Law, and the State Archives resides within the Department of the Secretary of State. So motor vehicles, corporations, elections, commissions, notaries, public are agents of the Secretary of State. Anybody who takes an oath files it with us, and the archives.
So basically everything.
Pretty much. And other duties apparently as assigned. Like,
right.
Who knows what the legislature will come up with next.
Right. Now, what drew you to do that? I mean, that's very complex. There's a lot of different moving pieces to that. What said, you know what? I want to contribute to Maine in this capacity.
Well, it's interesting. When I became Secretary of State, I learned very quickly that the most qualified person in the state of Maine to be the Secretary of State is the person that's leaving the office.
Yeah.
So in that case, it was Dan Godofsky was turned out. I'm now facing term limits, so next year you'll be electing a new Secretary of State. And what drew me to it, first of all, was some of the same things that drew me to the legislature. How I got into the legislature. I was a commercial cook for 20 years. I worked in printing and publishing. I was a bartender, bar manager. Landlord doesn't care where the rent money comes from. And I was overseeing a group of student workers in a kitchen at the University of Maine, and one of them had to leave school because she couldn't make all the payments on her school bill. Her installment plan had gone south. And I thought, I'm an alumni, I should be doing something about this. And what we first did was raise money in the kitchen so she could pay her bill and stay in school for the rest of the semester. I thought there ought to be an emergency scholarship plan. And I started shopping the idea around, and somebody said, well, have you talked to the local state representative? Maybe there's some state help. And I thought, what a great idea. So I called the fellow. He and I became very good friends, and he eventually talked me into running for the House. And I got elected, served 4 terms, chaired the Fish and Wildlife Committee for 3 terms. I was the Democratic chair of the Redistricting Commission 1 year, did a lot of different things. And when I was being termed out, I thought, I can go home, go back to the print shop, go back to the bar, but maybe there's something else I could do. I really didn't have any interest in the state senate because I had been chairing Fish and Wildlife for 3 terms. I thought if I run, I'll get elected, and I'll be the Senate chair of the Fish and Wildlife Committee.
Okay.
And it would be questionable whether or not I could do that for a couple of more years without slashing my wrists, because I was just about up to my eyes with, deer task forces and that sort of thing. So
right.
it was a great committee to be a part of, but I was just a little bit burned out.
Yeah.
and Secretary of State was coming open. I was really interested in the archives. I'd worked with Jim Henderson at the archives, and I thought, well, the rest of it I can learn. And boy, did I get an earful. I learned a lot over these last 13 years, and there's still new things I learn every day, you know, and we get to help people, which is the most gratifying part of the job.
I'm sure getting to work with very talented staff helps.
Oh, they're
with
extraordinary.
the learning curve.
Oh, they're
too.
extraordinary, and they're all people who are nationally recognized in their field. You know, Julie Flynn, who's our deputy at elections, is a national treasure. Patty Morneau, the deputy at motor vehicles, is part of the National American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators Board. You know, we're right now in the market for a new archivist, which we're in the interview stage right now to interview a new archivist. So it's pretty busy shop.
Now, your office has had to undertake very major initiatives, not just sort of the day-to-day operation. So you were able to oversee the first in the nation ranked choice voting operation. How did you guys undertake that? Because I can imagine there was a lot of conversations behind the scenes. How do we, you know, pull this off and do it in a way where people are going to trust the institution and the process?
Well, that was really the key. That's our stock in trade, is public confidence in our elections. And with ranked choice voting, it kind of devolved into like an Apollo 13 scenario where we really didn't have the additional funds we had hoped to get. We didn't have all the mechanisms we wanted to see in law, because it was very controversial, and there was not much agreement on how to proceed. But the staff that we had, we sat down and we thought, okay, what do we need to do first? What's the first thing we need to figure out? And then just work it out from there. And they designed the ballot style, which we put out for, you know, the public to see, and the questions we got were intelligent questions, thoughtful questions, which meant we knew that we were not confusing people. Coming up with a very simple recount process, because we had to have a recount process before you run an election so that people know what the rules are. And as it turned out, we did have a recount. Actually had a couple of them. So it was really, because it had never been done before, what we understood, well, we couldn't tell everybody what we were going to be doing because we didn't know. We could tell people where we were at any given moment. So transparency was our best friend in that entire process. It's like, okay, this is where we are. You know, we've gotten this many towns in, this many towns processed, this many towns to go. We had a glitch. This is what happened. And I think the public trusted that process. So we came back this last year and got a lot of that codified into law. So it was good.
Wonderful. And another sort of a high topic area that a lot of folks were paying attention to is when you served on the President's Advisory Commission on Election Integrity.
Yeah, I got a lot of hate mail.
A lot of national headlines for being on that, but you had a rhyme and reason to serving on there and a purpose for that.
Well, you know, Secretary Kobach was a bit of an electric figure, controversy around the country, and the National Association of Secretaries of State is kind of, you know, a really good, you know, best practice sharing type of group, and you get to know each other, get to know each other's families. And he had called me and said, you know, the president's talking about this commission, would you be interested in serving? And I said to him, I'm not looking for extra work, but let me kick it around. And our staff was like, oh yeah, if they're doing this, you've got to be there and tell our story. So I said yes. I got named to the commission, and it got very strange very quickly, because even though the vice president, who was the chair of the commission, said there are no foregone conclusions, no preordained outcomes, there were preordained outcomes and there were foregone conclusions. They just weren't telling us what they were. And you know, I caused some trouble. I asked some questions they didn't like, and they started walling me off. And this is where the press is really important. A couple of reporters were telling me, it's like, this has happened before, these are your rights, are you going to ask questions? And I sent a letter, you know, saying I want to know what we're working on. I want to know what our schedule is. I want to know who we're talking to. And the response I got from the White House was, we are reviewing your request with legal counsel. You know, am I not on this commission? And then it got weird. It got weird about the middle of October, and I'd gotten word from a reporter that the lead researcher on the commission had been arrested in Maryland on charges of possession of child pornography, which is not a good thing. And to this day, I don't know what became of them, but you know, and then that's when I wrote the letter and asked, demanding the information. And I was working from home one day, because in the fall, when you guys are not in town, you know, things can be slow enough that I don't have to drive all the way down here, and I'm remotely connected, and I get a Facebook message from a very highly placed friend of mine who said, can you give me a call? Myself. I called, what's going on? I said, I have a message for you from a chief of staff of a senator who does not want to be named. I said, oh. Matt, do you have a lawyer? Lawyer?
That's not a good question to have.
Yeah, and I really felt something dropping. If I'm in
Yeah.
trouble, I said, you need lawyers. And look, everybody's talking about you down here in Washington. But you're not going to take on the Department of Justice and the Trump White House by yourself. You need a legal team. Here's a name and a number you want to call. And I was actually frightened. That's the only time in the entire process I actually felt fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I called the number and I left a message. This woman named Melanie Sloan, who is described in her bio as Washington, D.C.'s most feared attorney.
Oh,
And she is a tough woman. And they called me back and said, we're so glad to hear from you. It's like, they want to go to court, And I said, well, I'm from Maine.
Right.
Usually we make a phone call and say, hey, I'm glad you like the applesauce, but I really need my mason jars back.
Mm-hmm.
I finally said, let's send a message, and yes, let's file the lawsuit, and we all know what happened. And the court ruled in our favor, and about 10 days later, President Trump dissolved the commission. So the hate mail I got turned around very quickly. People were like, please stay. At first I was like, please resign. Don't legitimize this sham organization.
Right.
And then when I filed the lawsuit, it was like, oh man, keep going.
Yeah.
And it was very strange to be on a first name basis with a lot of, I was on PBS NewsHour. My mother watches PBS NewsHour. And it was, I was on CNN not long ago, following up from now with Trump's latest outrageous claims. But
right. And I want to go back to the fact that you joined it, though, for a really great reason, the fact that to push back on voter fraud claims.
Yeah.
Because you take that really seriously in your office, and there seems to be a lot of misinformation around that every election cycle.
Well, we kind of characterize it like, the old legendary story about Halloween. And when I was a little kid, I grew up on a farm. I never went trick-or-treating because I lived too far out of town. But the teachers would always give us these dire warnings. Don't eat apples. Okay? No apples. And you know why, right? Razor blades.
Yeah.
And have you ever heard of a kid biting into a razor blade from an apple? If you get a kid to bite into an apple, you're doing great. And but it perpetuates itself in this urban mythology about the razors and the apples. And it's kind of the same thing with voter fraud, because you hear, like, even the president says, oh, everybody knows it's true. And no, we know the exact opposite, because we mathematically track the chain of custody of a ballot. I can tell you with authority who handles a ballot from the time it leaves the printing press to when it's sealed and locked in a ballot box. It's very specific who touches ballots. And, the idea, again, is to provide confidence that everything is happening properly. So the idea that you could have 3 to 5 million people voting illegally is just absolutely absurd, and it's mathematically impossible. So we wanted to tell our story about how great of a job our town clerks do, our local and state election officials, exactly how an absentee ballot is handled, how all those numbers are reconciled at the end to make sure that if a town gets 1,000 ballots, you account for 1,000 ballots. Somebody loses a ballot, you don't worry about losing the ballot because you've accounted for it. So it's really worked out quite well for us.
Automatic voter registration was one of the areas.
Great.
Yeah, it is great. We were able to pass it this past session, but it's going to take a couple years to implement.
But we have some things to build. Our computer people, the Deputy Secretary of State, when I hired her, made me promise to never make her testify in front of a policy committee. We don't know what she did in her former life because it's all top secret. We think it rhymes with thermonuclear, but we're not sure. But she is a computer genius, and she said that this should actually be a lot simpler than we originally envisioned. You have two different databases. You have the motor vehicle database and the elections database that are built on an entirely different platform, and the idea is getting them to talk to each other. And it'll actually make our elections even more secure because you have to affirmatively prove to get a driver's license that you're an American citizen. And so it makes it mathematically impossible to inadvertently illegally register to vote or to willfully illegally register to vote, because that is all going to be done through that confirmable database. And this, we actually, ironically, that component about citizenship was one that we had fought tooth and claw as completely outside the state's purview. We're not citizenship agents. We're not immigration officials. And, citizenship can be a very difficult thing to prove. If you don't have a birth certificate or you've been adopted from overseas, et cetera.
Right.
So, but with these mechanisms in place, it'll be a lot easier for voters, and it'll be much more secure in the system as well.
All good things.
All good things.
All good things. Real ID
Real ID
has been a journey.
It's been a journey. We've implemented it now. We're actually issuing the credentials. There's still a little bit of confusion about it. Again, something that the state fought very vigorously with good reason. And we've spent probably $2.5 million. And I'm not sure how much security it adds to the process, but it does put a lot more information. It makes it a true identity credential, which it wasn't before. It was a driver's license with your photograph on it. But now it's an identity credential, so it's a much stronger document.
And folks can go and get that now.
They can get it now, yes.
Yeah.
We're going to be changing over the design of the license shortly. It'll reflect some of the changes, but the changes are really back of the house, not front of the house. So you'll see a new design on the license here in a while, and if you've opted to get a real ID, you've presented different documents that have been scanned into the database. A different style of photograph doesn't look any different on the license, but we'll be able to match up photos if we think there's some criminal activity going on, that sort of thing. More or less for a law enforcement investigatory tool, more than anything.
So wrapping up our time together, legacy that you're leaving behind. You've done so much in your time, Secretary of State and in the House, but in particular, Secretary of State, what do you want people to remember from your service? Nothing
about me. I mean, I'm the least important component of all this. And being remembered for anything is usually bad. You know, you've been remembered for stealing something.
Right.
But I think what we've done is we've built a tremendous culture of boldness and creativity that I'd like to see continue. I think it's worked very well for us, for me. My job's been to support the staff. And I think my hope would be that someday somebody would say, you know, we used to do things this way and it worked really well for us. Never mind whether it's Matt Dunlap or Justin Chenette or whoever. We want to set a model more than anything. And I think we've worked so hard to have a paradigm where we serve our neighbors and try to provide answers to people when they have questions and be a resource for them. And I think really the greatest part of the job is being able to help people. Being able to help people is what I really like.
Piece of advice for your successor.
Don't go looking for trouble. It finds you all by itself.
It sounds like politics.
No, I think that's an important piece. Don't worry about things you can't control. Tell the truth. World stops for kids. And the most important rule of all, which is rule number 3, do it now. I actually banned Post-it notes for a while in the office. I said that Post-it notes, when people write a reminder, at the time it takes you to write the reminder, you could have gotten it done.
Right, you're putting it off.
Post-it notes are the tombstones of other people's priorities that you don't think are important enough to work on right now.
Put that on a bumper sticker. I like that.
So do it now. It's a very important rule.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for taking the time. I know you're really busy, and I want to thank you for all the work that I know it's not over with by a long shot. And
well, and thank you for what you do. I've watched you now for quite a few years, and you've done some very courageous things, and you speak the truth, which is something that doesn't happen enough around here.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. We'll end on a high note there.